Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. What is the current status of the civil wars raging in Iraq and Syria? What can be done by the United States, the United Nations, and other entities to help prevent this conflict and to bring peace and stability to the region? We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our program. You're watching Global Connections Television, which is an independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. Today we're taking a look at a very volatile area of the world, and that's in the Middle East, especially the countries of Iraq and Syria. As also, we'll focus a little bit on Israel and the Palestinians. My guest today is an expert in this area. My guest today is Dr. Robert Olson. Dr. Robert Olson is a retired professor of Middle East history and politics at the University of Kentucky. Professor Olson is the author of some 90 research articles, 80 essays and reference works, and 220 book reviews. Formerly, in the early 60s, Dr. Olson was a Peace Corps volunteer in Turkey. Dr. Robert Olson, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Well, thank you, Bill. It's a pleasure to be here.
I appreciate you being with me. Let's jump into this, Bob. There's so many hot spots in the Middle East. Who knows where to begin? But let's start with Syria, and then we'll work our way over to Iraq and to Israel and to Palestine. What is the current situation in Syria? What can be done? We see that there have been over 2 million people displaced. We see that there was paralysis in the UN Security Council as far as coming up with a resolution, but the UN is on the ground helping Syrians every day. But what is the current situation in Syria? We'll focus on that, and then we'll talk about what can be done.
Well, the situation is a disaster. As you just mentioned, a lot of humanitarian aid is coming in. The United Nations is playing a big role. But let me just mention, according to the latest statistics that I have, is that they think there's 1,300,000 refugees in Jordan now. Of course, all these are not in refugee camps, and the United Nations is not looking after all of them. In Turkey, they think 800,000, and in Lebanon, over 1 million. I was in Lebanon last December. I didn't get to go to all of the camps, but even in Beirut itself, there were just Syrian refugees all over. So the number one thing in Syria now is just a humanitarian disaster, and there hasn't been that much movement with all of the various with the Assad government, and then of course with the oppositional forces. And as you know, the latest thing is that more arms are going to be sent to them by the Europeans, the United States, and so forth. But now I think one of the biggest factors affecting Syria is the fact that the success of the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, today they just said, just call us the Islamic State, got a lot of arms. According to the latest statistics, they think up to $10 billion, 10 billions of arms, mostly given by the United States, are in the hands now of ISIS, of the Islamic State, and they've transported a good deal of them over to Syria, and they're massing to attack Lebanon. So I think that the situation now between Syria and Iraq is just inextricably linked.
Exactly. And the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has called for countries to not arm either side, to make sure you don't get more arms in there, because all we're going to do is see more fighting. And of course, as you mentioned, many of the arms going in are going to the radicals. They are going to the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria folks. They're going to Al-Qaeda. They're not going to the moderate rebels. I mean, some may be, but a large number may not be. And this is really going to be more detrimental, is it not, in the long run, to just keep arming people, especially people you're not sure whose side they're fighting on.
Well, Bill, over just what you just said, there are also differences between the groups that are supporting Assad. For example, Turkey is one of the major supporters. The Emirates, the Saudis, they're still giving arms, even though they say we're no longer giving arms and you shouldn't give arms and so forth. But you have a lot of independent, wealthy people who may not be attached to the government. They may be in intelligence services who are still providing substantial amount of money for which they can buy arms. So there's differences among the coalition of forces, including the United States, including European powers, and some of their allies, such as the Saudis, the Emirates, and the Kuwaitis. So it makes for so what happens is more arms are coming in to both sides, which I think is really detrimental to coming to some kind of negotiated solution or even some kind of stalemate between the two groups with regard to arms.
Exactly. And now we have been, the United States and the UN in general, the majority of the countries seems like have been in favor of having Bashar al-Assad leave and to have some other type of government take over in Syria. But when you look at the situation now, especially with ISIS, this very radical Islamic group that wants to apply Sharia law, wants to come in and really have a very draconian system, you see that the Iranians and the United States are working together. Iran and the U.S. have not exactly been partners over the past several years, but they're in support. Are we really, if we see what happened in Iraq, and we'll get into it in just a moment with the overthrow of Saddam Hussein, but would we really be better off at this point in time with all the instability to leave Bashar al-Assad where he is and to focus attention on dealing with the problems in Iraq and not worry as much about Syria? It's not to say you can't be involved, but if he goes and ISIS replaces him, it is a far worse situation than what we have today.
Bill, I think it's almost obligatory that they leave in Assad. From a geopolitical standpoint, first of all, the opposition against some of the radical Islamist movements, and also he still has a lot of support from the Christians, for example, some from the Kurds and the other minorities in Syria. So I think support for Assad will have to continue, which makes it more difficult because some of the United States allies and European allies, such as the Saudis and some of the Gulf Arab states, they, of course, are supporting the opposition, which contributes to this increased conflict and increased armed warfare and increased displacement of people that you just mentioned. 9 million, according to the latest United Nations figures, 3 million or 3.3 million refugees, and then displaced inside. And increasing problems with food, as you know. And the drought, of course, the temperatures are very high now. There's a continued drought in Syria. Temperatures are reaching 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and the water shortage is getting to be tremendous. So in addition to the refugee problem, we're really going to have a food problem in terms of providing food for the refugees and for the displaced people, and water. Water is getting to be a major concern in Iraq as well.
Exactly. You alluded to Lebanon and to Jordan earlier. These two countries are undergoing tremendous stress right now with these refugees pouring in. And fortunately, they've been very welcoming to them to a large degree, but you can only take in so many people. You have only so many resources. In fact, the refugee population in Jordan probably exceeds the actual Jordanian population. I may be wrong on that, but it's a huge number. And of course, you mentioned the United Nations as they're working with the UN High Commission for Refugees, UN Children's Fund, the World Health Organization, different groups like that. But those two countries are very fragile. They have very fragile governments, and the last thing the world needs is for them to have a problem and to collapse or to have some internal civil war.
Well, that is spot on, I must say, because given all of the unrest and turmoil and civil war in Iraq and Syria, it is important to mention Jordan, I think. And something that many people don't know is that Jordan has about 140,000 or 150,000 Chetans. And many of the foreign fighters that they talk about, the Islamist fighters in Iraq and Syria, are Chetans. King Abdullah of Jordan has made 2 trips within the last 3 or 4 months to Kadyrov, who is the leader, pro-Russian leader of Chechnya. And another thing is that many of the intelligence services in Jordan are Chetans and Circassians, because this is the way that the King Abdullah has kind of tried to integrate them in support for the throne. So Jordan is very crucial. And then if Jordan, of course, becomes destabilized by the Salafist forces, which may be the case, then, of course, 60% of the population of Jordan is Palestinian. Then you have even a broader extension of the so-called Arab-Israeli conflict, because now you have half of the Palestinians in the area are in Jordan. And so this well could, I'm not predicting it, but it well could exacerbate, the situation as well. We're already seeing the case of Jordan where the fighting is continued between Israeli intelligent, Israeli army and intelligence services, and in Jordan, because they're trying to destroy the Hamas organization in the West Bank to make it easier to have some kind of negotiations with Mahmoud Abbas. So there you see the Arab-Israeli conflict. You see Jordan is almost inextricably now tied with this unrest and civil war in Syria and in Iraq.
Mm-hmm. And that takes us to another area that's been off the radar screen for a little while, but it's coming back on now because there is conflict in the West Bank, there's conflict in Gaza. But we think back to 2008, 2009 with the horrific battles that took place in Gaza when the Israelis and the Palestinians were fighting in that area. And of course in 2012 there was another flare-up. But the situation over there is so fragile in that area. And I think the word that describes the whole situation right now is frustrating. It seems like that all sides seem to be frustrated. There's no movement on the peace process. You see that Gaza is one of the poorest areas in the world. How close, and what we're saying today, tomorrow will be totally probably negated, I would imagine, given how fast things change in the Middle East. But how close, and I don't want to be pessimistic, but are we looking at this bubbling over into a situation where the Palestinians and the Israelis become so frustrated, especially the Palestinians, and have another intifada, an intifada 3? Are we looking at that, or is it's difficult to predict, but certainly the ingredients seem to be there for that?
Well, a lot of news accounts and a lot of analysts in the Middle East are saying this. On the other hand, of course, the Palestinians now are isolated. We just talked about the disarray in the Arab world. No help's going to come from that direction. In Israel, you have a very strong conservative and a very strong right-wing element within the government who are determined, to annex the West Bank. At least 60% of the West Bank, which was allocated to Israel in the 1993 peace accords. So there's very little maneuvering room for the Palestinians, whether it's the Hamas in Gaza, and now they've joined, or they're negotiating with the PLO, with the Fatah movement in the West Bank. They have very little maneuvering room, and so if there is another outbreak of violence, as there's an intifada, which of course it will be a very bloody affair, and of course the United States is not going to do anything in that regard, because the negotiations led by John Kerry, of course, failed. Martin Indyk, who's one of the foremost experts and a former U.S. ambassador to Israel, has just resigned 2 days ago. He said he might go back, but I doubt it very seriously if he would once again become the interlocutor for the United States in these negotiations. So it's kind of a dire situation, and one filled with some worry as to what actually will evolve.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And of course, the Palestinians, I guess it was 2012, they went to the UN and became a non-member observer state. I may be wrong on that date, but anyway, I think that's what it was. And they now have status at the UN to join conventions, that type of thing, be part of UN agencies. They joined UNESCO. But they have an opportunity to, of course, Israel is a member of the United Nations, so they can both use the United Nations to make their cases. But as we look at that situation in Israel, in the West Bank, in Gaza, most experts have said we have to have a two-state solution. That when the United Nations set up Israel in 1948, or 47, 48, they set up a two-state situation for the Palestinians and the Israelis. But a lot of people today are talking about moving away from that two-state solution. How could it be that you could have a unitary state there, one state with the Palestinians and the Israelis living there, and yet have the Israelis have a, quote, Jewish, unquote, state? How is that possible, or do you have to have a two-state solution?
Well, you can't have almost all of the scholars that I know and with whom I'm familiar think that there's no possibility of a two-state solution. You have you have probably almost 600, if it depends upon if you include Greater Israel, almost 700,000 settlers in the West Bank. The area of Jerusalem is almost completely surrounded by Israel now. Israel said today they're going to build another couple thousand settlements in East Jerusalem. So the Palestinians are completely within an enclave in Jerusalem. It's about 306,000 Palestinians in the West Bank. So there can be little movement there. So there can't be any two-state solution. It's what kind of a solution would there be if you think of the settlers, for example, in the Israeli ministers who are in charge of the West Bank in terms of housing and so forth. They advocate very strongly that they'll take over the 60% of the bank. In Israel, the 40% is left for the Palestinians. 20% is controlled by joint Israeli-Palestinian patrols and intelligence, and even the 20% underneath the Palestinian Authority is, of course, completely under the control of the Israeli intelligence services. And the Americans, of course, co-opt that. What the United States wants to do, and I think this came out very well by President Obama. He had an interview with Jeffrey Goldberg in the Atlantic a few months ago. He says, well, if we don't have any kind of agreement on the Israeli-Palestinian front, we, that is the United States, can no longer manage the problem. So what this means now, in wake of the failure of the talks, that the United States recognizes that they can't manage it, and since they can't manage it, they have to pretty much adopt a position that Israel wants to adopt because of the importance of the Israeli lobby and the Jewish lobbies, the pro-Israeli lobby in the United States for domestic purposes. So domestic politics in the United States trump whatever may evolve in terms of between the Palestinians and Israelis with regard to the West Bank.
Exactly. And when you look at that situation over there, if you do have one single state, you look at the numbers, the Israelis versus the Palestinians, it becomes pretty obvious that the Palestinians are going to have larger numbers than the Israelis. And if you have a situation like that, you either have to extend the vote, if you're going to have a participatory democracy, which Israel is, you extend the vote to the Palestinians. If you don't do that, then you have what former Secretary of State John Kerry got into a bit of trouble on, saying it would be an apartheid situation. But in reality, that's exactly what it would be, would it not? I mean, people don't like using that term, but if you have people within your geopolitical boundaries and you don't allow them to vote, just like they did in South Africa, it's a two-tier system. There's discrimination that's taking place.
Of course. Well, there's something else, Bill, that's very important, is that with regard to Israel's demand for a Jewish state. Of course, this has been a demand for the last 25 or 30 years, and the Palestinians acquiesced in this. They accepted it back in 1974-75, but after, especially during the Nixon period when Henry Kissinger was the Secretary of State, of course, Israel rejected all these overtures that the PLO made, and so then that continued, this unrest, some terrorist acts, and so forth. But what is interesting is that there is a strong interplay. Many scholars of the Middle East think there's a strong interplay now between the demands of Israel for a Jewish state, okay, and of course what is happening now in Iraq as a result of the collapse of Syria and the collapse of Iraq. It's not surprising to scholars of the Middle East that now you're having a demand for an Islamic state among these oppositional forces in Iraq and Syria. And so they say, well, the only way that the Sunni Arabs are saying, well, the only way that we can the only way that we can assert whatever control we have in Iraq, because there's only 5 or 6 million Sunnis and 22 million Shia, but the Sunnis are a majority in Syria, maybe 75% of the population. And I think that ISIS, as we mentioned, is going to concentrate more on Syria, even in Iraq, because Syria is really, really crucial for their control. If they can get rid of the Assad regime and push the Alawites aside. And so they're going to say this is an Islamic State. So I expect in Iraq and Syria that this emphasis upon Islamic State. However, to a scholar, it seems improbable because they never really have had an Islamic State in Iraq since the medieval ages. The Ottoman Empire and the Persian empires were not Islamic states. Of course, they were dynasties. But what this means is that the propaganda, it means that the assertions that they make are going to become more radical, more exclusive, and I think even more difficult to manage by Europe, by all interested parties, but in our case, Europe and the United States, and certainly the UN will be able to do very little about it, I think.
Exactly. And let's segue right into Iraq, because that seems to be the hottest of the hot spots right now. They're all very, very dangerous. But we go back to March 19, 2003. The Bush administration put together a coalition of what they call the Coalition of the Willing, invaded Iraq looking for weapons of mass destruction. There were people who said we should not go in. Dr. Hans Blix, who headed up the UN verification team, said there were no weapons. Many other experts said that. We went in. Today, as you look back to 2003, just about everybody with whom I've spoken, or a large number of people anyway, said that this was the most disastrous blunder in the foreign policy history of the United States. It destabilized the region. It made the situation much worse, got rid of at least the buffer between Iran and other parts of the Middle East. How detrimental was that invasion back in 2003, and are we paying the price for it today?
Oh, absolutely. There's no question about that. I think there's a consensus among Middle Eastern scholars, whatever their political persuasion may be, that it was a debacle of huge proportions, and of course it destroyed the state of Iraq. It destroyed the infrastructure. It made for the Sunni resistance, who allied with the United States for a while. But now, because of their unhappiness with the Shia government, they've reorganized. And what is missing in much of the media for the first week or so of the coverage was of just how many ex-Baathists, now we could say even secular nationalists in Iraq, are in control of things. Of the accounts that I've read, maybe be 34 major generals, lieutenant generals, colonels, and so forth are running the show. My understanding now is from the Middle Eastern press, the Arab press, is that they are actually in charge of this, and the ISIS is off doing the fighting, but now the management of the cities that they have, certainly something like Mosul, are in the hands of these Sunnis. So it's been disastrous. But what these secular Sunnis want to do, the Naqshbandi armies and all things, is to make an inclusive kind of operation. It's been brilliant, Bill. I think that that ISIS and the Baathist generals and so forth have planned a really brilliant campaign, and that's why you see the quick collapse of the army and the police and so forth, especially in the Sunni areas, because once they realized how organized all of these oppositional forces were, not just the Islamist forces, the non-Arab Islamist forces, but the former Sunni operations that, of course, that they fled. And their eye is also, of course, on Syria, because, as I mentioned, they need the support of the Sunnis in Syria, 75% of the population, whereas in Iraq, of course, there are many more Shia. So and now we've ended up in a situation that is much more difficult to handle, to manage, to do anything, even than Saddam Hussein was, because as a dictator, at least he was able to keep the lid on the complete disarray and perhaps fragmentation or even partitioning, of Iraq. And the partitioning of Iraq into three divisions of people talk is not an easy thing to do. Maybe the Kurds could do this, but as we can see, the middle area of the Sunni Arabs, they're not going to settle for that, because they want to extend their influence over to Syria, which is the crucial thing for them.
Exactly. And of course, we think back to 2003, and we were told at the time that there were weapons of mass destruction. This invasion would only cost $50 billion. The oil would pay for it. We would go in, we would be out. all of that, none of that was true. And we know today, a lot of people knew back then that whole argument was built on misinformation, disinformation. And we see today it has cost over $2 trillion. There have been over 200,000 Iraqis killed. 4,500 U.S. troops have been killed. The area, the whole Middle East is inflamed, and a large part of it was because of that invasion. And the media today are making the same mistakes. They're putting on the same talking heads like Vice President Dick Cheney, Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz, Jerry Bremer, who was the administrator, people who got us into this problem. And if we're going to avoid these in the future, they need to get more objective people on the air. That's just an editorial comment on my part. But Dr. Bob Olson, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you. I am Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us on today's Global Connections program.